Noon the fifth day, Mr. Hooper, Lockheed Ventura saw us. He swung in low and he saw us too. A young pilot, a lot younger than Mr. Hooper anyway. He saw us and he come in low, and 3 hours later a big fat PBY comes down and started to pick us up. You know, that was the time I was most frightened, waiting for my turn. I'll never put on a life jacket again. So 1,100 men went in the war. 316 men come out. The Sharks took the rest June the 29th, 1945. Anyway, we delivered the bomb.
Shark unleashes chaos in a beach community off Cape Cod. It's up to a local sheriff, a marine biologist, and a salty old seafarer to hunt the beast down. Hey, the theater's open. Extras and Epilogues, Wet, Hot Summer is back for the second week. We're talking.
You have not done well with that title this entire month.
Some things, your witty remarks elude me, you know?
It's never gone well for you.
No, it never has, and it never will. This is Extras and Epilogues, and we're continuing the tradition of both blockbusters and monstrous creatures. With tonight's film, the 1975 horror classic Jaws, which, growing up, I thought was the name of the shark. I always thought he was Jaws, but no.
That's him.
No, it's Bruce.
It's Bruce. Not that anyone in the movie ever says that.
Nor should they. That would be very weird.
No. Yeah, it'd also be weird if his name was Jaws.
If so, well, he's got big jaws. I don't see him having big bruises.
Well, not that you saw.
It would be funny if partway through the film a woman comes in as they're talking about what did this, and she goes, "I know who did it. It was Bruce." And she tells a story about how she had a pet shark when she was a kid. Her dad flushed it down the toilet, medical waste or radiation or something, and now big shark.
Hey, wait a minute.
And only she can stop it.
I think that was the plot of Jaws, 17?
Jaws 44.
The thirst for revenge.
the thirstening. My name's
He knows the truth.
the smell of devastation, the smell of beach population.
Just say chum and get it over with.
Hello, chums. My name's Shannon Young, and I'll be the host tonight. With me, of course, we have Mr. Double H.
That's some bad hat, Harry.
Hey, that sounds familiar. We're talking about blockbuster films all month long here on Extras and Epilogues, and when you think of blockbuster films, one of the original big blockbusters and one of the most influential films of all time, especially in the horror genre, especially in the make horror films about real things that exist and make people irrationally afraid of them. You have to talk about the film Jaws, which has done more to destroy the shark population than all of the terrible films they've made since then, including, I'm going to bring up a list and we'll talk about them. All horror films.
Deep Blue Sea comes off the top of my head here, right?
Yes. Deep Blue Sea is probably...
they ate him.
Well, a fucking...
shark ate him.
A fucking shark ate him. I was thinking of all the terrible shark horror films that they've made, mostly
like
in
the Meg.
No. You're thinking still way too highbrow. I'm talking about films like I'm talking about
Sharktopus,
Sharkenstein.
Oh, okay.
Ghost Shark.
Sharkenstein.
There was one where it was like Jaws 666, where the shark was a monster. I have pulled up a list before we talk about a good shark film.
Oh no.
I have pulled up a list of shark films made in the wake of Jaws, and we're not going to count the actual sequels to Jaws, which were also terrible.
Yes,
except maybe the Jaws 2 might have been good, but Jaws 3D, Jaws the Revenge, we're going to skip all of those. We're going to talk about the other ones. So after the original Jaws came out, I think this is actually in chronological order. So there was the Jaws of Death. This is still in the 80s. Jaws of Death, Shark Kill, Tintorera, Killer Shark, Orca the Killer Whale, which I have seen that one, Cyclone, which is about I mean, basically, I guess it was Sharknado before Sharknado. I can't believe we forgot about Sharknado. Up from the Depths, The Last Shark, Devilfish, Night of the Sharks, starring Treat Williams, Deep Blood, Cruel Jaws, which might be my favorite one.
Yeah, I like that one. That's a good one.
There was Creature, one just called Shark, because they decided to skip all of the wondering. There was one called Shark Attack.
Sure.
Good on you. Deep Blue Sea, like you mentioned before. Shark Attack 2, because the first one was so good they made a sequel.
You must.
I gotta go through this whole list. Give me a second. Shark Hunter, Shark Man, and the subtitle says A New Breed of Predator. I'm gonna send you the. let me send you the. I want you to see the covers of these. I'm putting in the text on the chat real quick. You need to go along with me here because the covers are what makes part of it great. Shark Attack 3,
really sells the whole thing.
Megalodon, Shark Zone, Open Water, which I think is actually a good film if I remember correctly. Never seen it, but I've heard it's
a popular one at the very least.
Red Water, Dark Waters, Megalodon, 12 Days of Terror, Shark Attack on the Mediterranean, Blue Demon, Raging Sharks, Hammerhead, and now you start to get into the really bad ones. This is getting to the really bad ones. Spring Break Shark Attack, Open Water 2, Sharp Teeth, Sharks in Venice? Sharks in Venice, okay.
Sharks in Venice, yeah. Yep.
Marina Monster, which has the best cover. Look at the cover of that. It's a guy in a boat.
Oh my God. They just photoshopped that picture right in there.
Into the shark's mouth.
Oh, man.
We got more, folks. Hang out with us here for a second. Shark Swarm, Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus, Malibu Shark Attack, Psycho Shark, which I think was a sequel. It was a spinoff of Psycho Dad.
He was crazy.
He was the craziest shark. Mega Shark versus Crocosaurus. The Reef, Sharktopus, Dino Shark, Shark Knight, which I remember because I think Monica Keene is in that, and I had a big crush on her.
Let me save you some trouble here. This is going to go on for another 30 movies if you keep doing this. And there's also 2 pages.
Oh, I didn't realize there were 2 pages. Yeah, all right. Well, geez.
Oh, yeah.
I can't keep this going forever.
Let me hit some highlights as we go along the way here. Don't miss out on Santa Jaws.
Santa Jaws.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Ozark Sharks, they're right here in your backyard now. That's how you can't get away from them.
Right. Well, there's Shark Exorcist. Satan has jaws.
I do love the phrase, Arkansas Women's Prison Massacre.
I just saw that one. I like that you skipped over.
Happening?
As an Indiana Jones fan, I'm surprised you skipped over Raiders of the Lost Shark.
Oh, I started at the bottom, if I'm being honest.
Oh, okay.
I'm working my way up from the bottom, and not necessarily of the list, but holy shit, that second page is still another 50 movies.
Oh, God. Oh, God.
Hang on page 2, I got one that I want you to read out loud.
Okay.
Because it's so ridiculous. I'm going to drop it in the text right now. There it is.
Hold on. Well, that's Big Shark.
That's just Big Shark.
That's Big Shark.
I mean, look, they told you what they were selling. Oh, there's also Cocaine Shark. Because I guess Cocaine Bear did well enough that you got to do that.
Yeah. I'm surprised you didn't mention
Amityville Shark House.
Well, don't forget about Dick Shark.
I'd like to. There's also Doll Shark.
For those of you that can't see this picture, it's a woman with her mouth open, and it looks like she's going to perform fellatio on a man, but it's a little shark coming out of his pants.
On page 2, there's also Shark Side of the Moon.
Side of the Moon!
Sharkula. Well, Shark Side of the Moon is a werewolf shark.
Of course.
I think it's a were shark thing.
Yeah.
There's Sharkula, of course, like Dracula, yeah, naturally.
You got Noah's Shark.
Oh. I like the one that just straight up calls itself Bad CGI Sharks. That's the name of the movie.
At least they're honest with that.
What they're selling right there on the cover.
And then, of course, there's you can't forget Sky Sharks. That's when the sharks are in the sky.
Of course.
Point is,
that's a solid 10 minutes devoted to the worst things you're going to hear this week.
I think Amityville Shark House might be my favorite film of all time now, and I've never watched it. When we talk about how bad Neil Breen films are, somehow Neil Breen's films are worse than this. That should tell you something. But the point of this, it wasn't to just make you laugh, which you're cracking up right now wherever you are.
Obviously,
the point was,
and you're welcome.
Was the point of just how influential the film Jaws was, that it spawned a million ripoffs, and it pretty much inspired an entire genre of shark horror films. I don't think they've ever made a shark film where the shark was friendly. Like there's not a free Big Willie or whatever it is about sharks.
Free Willy. Big Willie is next month. That's Will Smith.
That's correct. So if you've never seen Jaws, we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about it tonight. We're going to review it. Let's get started. Released June 20th, 1975, which makes this a fairly old film before any of us were born.
Literally almost 40 years to the day. 50 years to the day.
50.
Tomorrow
Yeah.
will be 50 years to the day.
How apropos.
That's wild. No, I'm sorry. 49, because it's 2024, but still. Yeah, 49 years to the day.
Still 49 years. That's kind of a... That's a good one, too.
That's wild.
Directed by the great Steven Spielberg, which a lot of people, I think, forget about that. They forget that this is a Spielberg film.
Yeah.
Because
well, he doesn't do a lot of horror in this. You know, we had that question last week about whether or not Jurassic Park was a horror movie. I said, I don't think it's a horror movie, but it has horror elements. I think you'd be hard pressed to get anyone to agree that this is anything but a horror movie. The point is to scare you.
Right. It is a scary film. I would argue that Jurassic Park, the point is to scare you with science and what if.
Well, Michael Crichton would definitely agree. He wrote a horror book. It wasn't meant to be fun.
This one written by Peter Benchley, I think, who did the original novel, and he did the screenplay. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. He had a co-writer whose name I forget because they were billed second, and generally that means it was just somebody there to punch it up. But yeah, so he wrote both the original novel and was then asked to turn it into a screenplay afterward, which usually is good news. And to have one do it so differently, so drastically differently. I mean, Michael Crichton did the same thing with Jurassic Park. Shows you how commanding Spielberg is as a director and a guy who can both work with you but also tell you what he wants up front. And
considering his track record, I'd say he's probably right.
But importantly, in this movie, I mean, at this point in time, he was kind of I don't want to say an unknown. I don't think this was his first film, if I remember correctly, but he was not the commanding presence of Steven Spielberg that you might expect.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that, actually. What I'm looking at it right now. What did Steven Spielberg direct before Jaws? And
this was his first movie. I don't recall that.
So
as a director,
actually, he directed some shorts in the 60s. That doesn't feel right. I don't think he's that old, but maybe he is. Directed a lot of TV, Night Gallery, Columbo, stuff like that. But and TV films. But he did Sugarland Express in '74. That was his first. That was his first, big film. And he hit one after another almost. Sugarland Express I'm not super familiar with, but you had Jaws in '75. You had Close Encounters of the Third Kind in '77, which is another amazing film. It's spectacular in so many ways. He did 1941, then Raiders of the Lost Ark, and then E.T., Twilight Zone, Indiana Jones Temple of Doom. That's what he just started to hit.
Importantly, he did part of Twilight Zone. Twilight Zone was
it was an anthology. Yeah. So
right, because that's where John Landis had his infamous scenario.
Yes, one of the all-time tragic events.
Ooh, so God, it was bad.
Yeah, he's done. He didn't do much before Jaws. I don't know if Jaws put him on the map or if Close Encounters really put him on the map. Probably both. It was a 1-2 punch. It was a good combo because I remember Close Encounters being also, when you talk about influential films, if you talk about extraterrestrials, probably the most influential extraterrestrial film to this date. People are still referencing it constantly, but it's another show for another time. Tonight we're talking about Jaws, starring Roy Scheider, who does amazing, Robert Shaw, who is probably the best part of the film, I'd say.
Yeah, and perfectly cast.
Yes.
You can't imagine anybody else in the role of Quint.
What an asshole.
Now that I've seen it, and I didn't say this earlier, but this was my first time seeing this movie, surprisingly, at almost the age of 40. But yeah, no, he's just spot on. Perfect.
Yes, from the moment you see him, with that incredible intro with scratching the chalkboard. Richard Dreyfuss in an early role. He's also great in this film. And Lorraine Gray and a number of other people. Now, most people are going to be most familiar with this film from the joke in the 2016 Ghostbusters, where Kristen Wiig tells Andy Garcia, don't be the mayor from Jaws. And he gets really upset, which I thought was a funny scene. And if you watch Jaws, you'll know why. Because the mayor in Jaws is a fucking idiot. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. but very accurate of a politician, especially in that day and age. It's 124 minutes of maritime fun and horror. It's great for the. It's
great. The term for it.
Great for families. Great for kids. Budget versus box office. $9 million budget, well spent, versus $476 million in revenue, which I believe we call that
bonafide
blockbuster.
Blockbuster, yeah, absolutely. I talked to my dad this past weekend, his Father's Day, and I talked to him a couple of times. And at one point in time, I told him we were doing the show. He's never listened to any of the shows because he can barely function on his iPhone in the first place. But no, I wish he would, honestly, because there's a lot of stuff we talk about that I think he would enjoy. But I often bring up, especially when we're doing movies that I know he saw in theaters, hey, tell me a little bit about what your experience there, because he's often told me, hey, I went and saw, there was a group in New Madrid, there's a little theater down there called the Dixie Theater that's now used as a performance place. It's where I did stand-up some time ago. I emceed a couple shows there, but it was a movie theater in his day. Even before I was born, that was no longer the case. But it was a single screen movie theater, and I know for a fact that he saw the original Ghostbusters there, saw Raiders of the Lost Ark there, and saw this movie there. I asked him, because we were doing this, I told him somehow I had never seen it. And he goes, you didn't like horror movies as a kid, which I remember pretty distinctly. But he said, yeah, he distinctly remembered going in and watching this movie at least 3 times while it was in theaters. Wow. And one day they went and saw it the first time, and it was him and a buddy of his named Tim. They went in and watched it, and as soon as it was over, they went, well, I don't have shit else to do. Let's just go back.
Here we go again. It's us on Diablo. Yeah. Here we go again.
Yeah. They just went right back in and watched it the second time. He said, I think the next time was the next weekend, but he said, I remember just like every time picking up on new stuff. So he's I bring it up here because he's part of the reason it's made $476 million.
This is when it comes to horror films, there's various degrees of horror films and how good they are. This is a mature horror film. This is a thinking man's horror film. This isn't one of those schlock fests like a Sharknado or like Zach would like Terrifier or something like that. This is a very smart horror film, the same vein as The Thing, or it's very well done and produced. Like one of my favorites, we reviewed before, American Werewolf in London. It is a respectable horror film. It's not a schlock fest. It's got a respectable director, huge actors. I mean, this is the kind of horror film you show people when you want them to take horror seriously, and not just be a midnight film or something.
Absolutely.
With that said, it's not perfect. It's almost perfect, but I told you I was going to complain about something in watching it again today, because I have seen this film before. I've seen this film once or twice in my day, because unlike Hunter, I was a huge horror fan, and I still am a huge horror fan. It's my favorite genre by far. One thing that always bothered me about this film, and we talked about this before the show a little bit, and I don't have a huge, it's not like I'm going to like tear the movie apart because of this, but it was like something that bugged me. The opening scene is one of the most infamous opening scenes in cinema history. It's the girl, the beach party, the girl and the guy run. She strips naked. She jumps in the water and gets attacked by the shark. She's the first victim. The way the shark attacks her, and like I said, we talked about this before the show. She's in the water. She kind of dips underwater for a second, comes back up once or twice, which never happens really again throughout the film. The shark just murders people like indiscriminately. Yeah. But this first girl, maybe because she was so cute, maybe because she was naked, I don't know. He toys with her a little bit, flirts with her a little bit. He pulls her underwater, I guess, with his gums. He just, he's tasting her. He's tasting her. And then as he, I assume, clamps down, even though there's no blood yet, he then drags her, of course, mind you, her head and arms are above water, and she just starts going through the water, like she's being propelled, she's being pulled. And then finally, after enough screaming, she goes underwater, the blood comes up, and that's it. It's a very good opening scene. It grabs you by the throat, and it really never lets you go, but it's just so silly to look at it. It's kind of silly the way the shark drags her through the water, like she's on a little jet ski or something, and the way he toys with her before he pulls down. If that had happened more in the film, I wouldn't be as upset. I get it's the opening scene. If she would have just been pulled down immediately, it wouldn't nearly have had the same impact. So I think they were doing it for cinematic reasons. So like I said, I'm not saying that it's a bad film because of that, but that always bothered me. It still bothers me when I watch it again. But from that opening scene to the end of the film, I honestly can't think of many things I didn't like. Not to do too many spoilers.
I think the only other thing that stuck out to me,
the ending. I'll talk about that at the end.
The ending itself didn't bother me, but I remember telling so Sarah had seen this movie 20 something times. She was kind of leading me through it and going like, "Hey, you really got to make sure you catch this part and all that." When Quint does get eaten, I remember saying specifically like, "Oh, it doesn't look great there." Like, and I get it's 1975.
Sure,
they're doing
it's
as much
an
as they can on a $9 million budget. Yeah, it's the best that they can, but it looks a little too what's the word I want here? Floppy, a little too. The shark is very like you said. It's not even the animatronics of it so much as it is the just like, oh, I can kind of see where he's like sliding down into the costume there. Yeah. That part got me. I wanted that to be. I know they did a lot of like off screen, not necessarily off screen, but like underwater kills. I would have been fine with Quint being batted off the boat and then just the blood coming up from there. Yeah, because I feel like it would have been more visceral. That's when I really need to see like something just awful, happen to him in the process instead of just kind of slipping down into the thing.
I don't disagree with you on that. The thing I think that saved it, because on the surface of the water, it is kind of cheap looking in some ways. But what I think really saves it is Robert Shaw's performance of being eaten, the terror as he's kicking at the shark. You know what I mean? He does a fantastic job of selling it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's a wrestling term for you kids out there. He's selling the hell out of that death. And it was a pretty brutal death. And something I didn't notice until someone told me later is watch at the very end of the film when Roy Scheider is fighting the shark and the shark is opening his mouth. You can see chunks of flesh in his teeth from Quint, which is pretty brutal. That's pretty brutal, man. That's
vile, man.
This movie,
good.
It didn't play games. They didn't have a lot to work with because famously the shark didn't perform well in the water.
Temperamental.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they hit it a lot.
Believe it or not, in 1975, it was very difficult to get an animatronic to work in the water for months at a time.
Yeah. But what they did when they did show the shark, it was fantastic. Some parts you could kind of tell, like, oh, clearly that's just an animatronic going through the water. But for the most part, it was, especially for 1975. Again, man, I have said this a million times on the show, and probably 90% of the films Hunter and I read off at the beginning jokingly are CG. They're CG sharks, and they look terrible.
They look awful.
Nothing will ever be better than practical effects. I said it about The Thing, even Ghostbusters. Whenever you see, Slimer, the Scolari Brothers, stuff like that, those are puppets or animatronics that they then kind of digitize to give it that, that ghostly look. But
unreal, unnatural appearance.
The shark is so scary in this film because it looks real. It's really there interacting with people. It's not people on a soundstage. I mean, they're out in the water. No. This is very scary. They do a great job of it. So the basic plot, because I know a lot of the times we just kind of talk about the film without discussing the plot because we're terrible people. We're a year into this, we're still getting our feet, getting our sea legs.
We also kind of expect you to come in knowing what's going on. Like if you're coming to us for the plot of the movie, that's not the intention. We can definitely cover it, but we're going to spoil the hell out of everything that you come to see here, or come to listen to it here. So
immediately, they've got a shark problem in this bay and this cape. And the mayor does not want to shut the town down because of the holiday festivities that are coming up. It's a tourist attraction, and the
4th of July.
4th of July is coming up, baby. And Roy Scheider is the sheriff. He is trying to sheriff, right? If I remember correctly, Sheriff Brody.
Yeah, he's the sheriff of Amity. Yep, comes from New York.
Yeah, not an Islander, not a. But he's trying to shut it down because of the shark. They try to cover it up at first. More people die. It becomes well known that it's a shark, and then it's the hunt for the shark and trying to take it on. It's all done so well, and that's what I like about the film is the characters feel like real people. It never really gets bogged down with too much exposition. It never gets bogged down with too much dry dialogue. It's quick. It's meaningful. Everything hits. For a 2-hour film, it didn't feel like a 2-hour film. I can't find much to complain about.
It feels like 2 1-hour films. That was, and that's not a complaint. But it does feel like I remember Sarah telling me like, okay, as the boat sails, like this is where the movie becomes another movie. Like once the 3 of them set sail, it's a whole other movie. Now you needed everything that comes before that to get the full effect of what's going on, why it's so important.
Of course.
But it does feel like a totally different movie once it becomes just about the 3 of them. And I'll say I think I liked the second half better than the first. not that I didn't like everything that came before that, but it really, for me, I mean, the movie really does kick off once the three of them set sail. Now, I would not have wanted to watch 2 hours of that. That would have been way too much. It would have been more like a spot fest of a movie. There would have been a lot of downtime and then a lot of uptime and no real like middle ground. So I like the exposition building up to that. But yeah, 2 hours not wasted at all. There's nothing there that needs to go. I have to imagine, knowing Spielberg, there was a 4-hour cut of this at some point in time, and they went, "Guy,
we gotta cut this down.
We gotta bring it down, right?" The novel itself includes like a mafia plot, apparently, because I've never read the book. But the book was a bestseller. And that's part of the reason that it was so like guaranteed it was going to be a big deal here. The mafia gets involved somehow. Also, Dustin Hoffman's character, Richard Dreyfuss. Richard Dreyfuss' character has an affair with Brody's wife. Like, that's why they're so chummy in the movie. But they cut all of that from the actual filming. They went, none of this is necessary. It's just because he dies in the novel. That character dies. The only one who makes it back is Brody. And I think that it was rightly someone looked at that and went, this is unnecessary. Yeah, this is too much.
That feels like piling on for the sake of piling on. Also, I take the opposite approach. I actually do like the first half of the film better because I when it comes to horror films, especially like monster features or disaster films, which is kind of a disaster film in its own way, I always like the lead up. I like the mystery. I like them, piecing the puzzles back together. And then the monster part, once you see the monster, it gets less interesting to me. Not that it's less interesting. It's just I like the build.
No, I get it.
Yeah, this film had a great build.
Absolutely.
It's like The Thing. I love the build up to The Thing. It's those quiet moments of maybe everything's okay, and then you see how things fall apart. Those are always my favorite parts on a horror film. That's why I don't like horror films that hit you from the beginning and just keep splattering because there's no build, there's no payoff. And I think that's a lost art in films.
I really like what you're saying, the quiet parts of the second half. The second half to me feels like a play. Like, there's just those three characters and the shark. You could stage that. You could do a stage version, and if somebody hasn't, I'd be surprised. But you could totally do a stage version of what happens in the second half of that of the movie.
It turns into a buddy film.
The quiet parts of that. Oh yeah, and the quiet parts of it are the best parts. I mean, the most famous scene, I have to assume, from the movie is Brody slinging chum into the water, turned, and just the shark fin in the background. He turns, he sees it, he gets up, delivers the classic line, "You're going to need a bigger boat." That to me is the perfect little slow, quiet. There's no musical cue. There's no, you have any idea what's happening. The movie doesn't tell you, hey, look over here at this thing that's about to happen. It just lets it happen. And that is the most powerful part.
Since you brought it up, the musical cue, great film. This soundtrack, this has one of the most iconic film themes of all time. John Williams, he did it again. He got another one.
So this was one of the first, much like Spielberg, this is one of the first ones that he did. I don't think it was his first film score, but it was one of those things where he was also kind of languishing in not obscurity, but not the renown that he would have later on. And I put this in the trivia because I thought it was great. When he first played the score that he put together, including the famous 2-note for Spielberg laughed at him and said, quote, "That's funny, John, but what did you really have in mind?" He was not a fan at first. He thought it didn't fit, that it was too simplistic. He watched it again, was eventually he watched it through again, was eventually convinced, and he was the one who said later on the movie would not have been half as successful without John Williams. Williams himself said, "This is what jump-started my career." So a big movie, not just for Spielberg, but John Williams as well.
Yeah, and everybody that did this film did an amazing job. Like I said, the mayor, I especially, even though I didn't like the character because you're not supposed to, I thought the guy that played him did a great job and really conveyed that sense of he's trying to do right by the town, but he's overlooking the danger, and you know something bad's going to happen. Yep. It's that creeping dread. Horror is at its best when it has creeping dread. There's another film we'll probably never review. We'll never say never, but in case we don't, I want to mention it here. There's another film that's kind of similar called The Bay. I don't know if you've ever watched it. It is it's a found footage film. I think it's a Barry Levinson film. I might be wrong on that, but it's one of the few big budget found footage films about a Bay Area town that is getting ready for their upcoming festival, and people are dying in the streets suddenly because they're getting sick. And I don't want to spoil it in case you do watch it, but it's one of the best found footage films I've ever watched, and it's horrific once you find out what is actually going on. But it's a very similar, we're not going to cancel, the big event because some people are getting sick. That's ridiculous. And you know something terrible is going to happen. And the body count in that one's a lot higher than this one. But this one is a little bit more shocking because, again, this is 1975. There's never been anything like this done before. There had been horror films for as long as there have been films, but the visceral, murdering of an attractive naked girl in the beginning, or a little kid, or you see the leg falling down, you see the head coming out of the boat. I mean, there's so much of this film that people weren't used to. Even films like Halloween was, oh God, when was the original Halloween? Was that
79, I believe? No, I think it was earlier.
78.
Was Halloween 71?
78.
78. Okay, so it was later. So it was 3 years later. Yeah.
So there weren't a lot of horror films out there that really showed you the blood and gore like this one did. This was a shocking film when it came out. Of course, today it would be tame by a lot of people's standards, but back then, man, this thing shocked some people, and it scared people too. This movie scared people from going out in the ocean. This really did do more to hurt the reputation of sharks than anything else in the history of sharks.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so many times now people have had to come back and say, look, this was a movie. The intention was not to make you think this is how sharks work. They're not. We joke about this a lot. We were just talking about it earlier. Shark-infested waters is not a thing. The sharks live there. You are infesting their waters.
Yeah.
That's how that goes there. People-infested waters.
If the shark starts coming into gaming grounds and he attacks people, then you have reason to be concerned.
Then there's a problem.
There's a problem.
And importantly, we talked about this earlier too off the show with Jesse, but sharks are and can be dangerous. Yes,
of course. Yeah. Look at them.
But the intention is not, well, there's a shark, we better go and kill it. Sharks are much like other things like spiders, like snakes, that people are afraid of. Most of the time, if they're in their environment doing their own thing, there is no reason for you to be afraid of them, as long as you're not antagonizing them, or B, for that matter, kill them, because again, they have their own benefit to their ecosystems.
Nor should you be in the water.
Fuck a wasp. Like, you can kill a wasp all day long. I don't give a shit about a wasp. But other than that,
once again, PZ85 taking a strong stance against wasps. Nature's asshole. No one likes them.
Correct.
They serve no purpose. I forgot to mention, we've kind of jazzing about this film this whole time, riffing on it, but this was also important to note, a critically acclaimed film. This is one of the all-time classics. 97 approval rating, percent approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, 87 out of 100 on Metacritic. That's universal acclaim. 4 out of 4 stars from Roger Ebert, someone that we both love and respect very much, who said, a sensationally effective action picture and a scary thriller that works, all the better because it's populated with characters that have been developed into human beings. And I've said this time and time again about horror films. A lot of horror films, especially a lot of successful ones now, unfortunately, like the ones that make the most money, have almost no characterization for anyone except maybe 1 or 2 people, and everybody else are just, they're part of the body count, or they're there for titillation. Horror films work best when you have characters that you care about, and this film fleshes out its characters, no pun intended, and they feel like real people. That's so important to a horror film. Any film,
absolutely,
but especially a horror film.
Importantly, I don't normally put the number of scores. Rotten Tomatoes is they do critic scores and audience scores. I always pull the critic scores from them. Metacritic is exclusively critics, and then occasionally we'll put Cinema Score, which is exclusively audiences. That's where I try to get the cross section. I didn't find a Cinema Score for this one. I don't recall off the top of my head what the audience review or rating was on Rotten Tomatoes, but 97% is great. It gets better when you realize this movie's been out for almost 50 years, and so it's got 102 critical reviews. Right. Generally, these things top out in double digits at most. It's usually up in the 20s, maybe the 50s, depending on how long it's been out. This movie's been reviewed on that particular site. And say what you will about Rotten Tomatoes, but critical scores I'm more interested in than audience ones for the purposes of what we're doing. Sure. 102 reviews, and it's a 97% approval rating. That's pretty valuable from just a cross section. If you can't really do what we do here objectively. We use that term sometimes. Right. It's not really how it works. But if you want to approach something like objectivity, over 100 people who make this their profession saying not only is it good, it's great, and some of them saying it's damn near perfect. I think this is the highest reviewed movie that we've covered here. I could be wrong about that.
No, I think you're right. It was either this or Neil Breen, yeah.
Well, importantly though, Neil Breen was the only person to review his movie, and
that's true.
That makes a big difference.
Even he only gave it 2 out of 5, so even he was disappointed. You mentioned,
he said, "Where's my movie? I don't need this.
I don't need this." He really doesn't. That dude's so rich. That's why he makes vanity projects. When you talked about the part earlier with Roy Scheider, with Sheriff Brody, he's throwing the chum in the water and you see the shark bite it. It just reminded me that there are so many. You've probably seen clips of this movie because there's so many parts that are so visually stimulating, and the cinematography, the directing, everything clicks on so many levels. There's so many shots that I will always remember. I think one of my favorites, other than that one, and then of course the beginning with the underwater shot of the girl, in the water and the shark getting closer to her. There's a part later on where he's sitting there and he keeps looking out at the water because he's paranoid about the shark at this point. He's the only one worried about the shark. And he keeps looking over, over people. There's a guy talking to him, hears screaming, and he looks over and he sees the rope being lifted up. Yeah. And when the shark finally does attack, there is this shot where they zoom in on him, but it seems like everything else around him zooms out. It's one of the best shots I've ever seen in a film ever. It's so good.
Yep. Forced perspective. It's one of those where I don't know that, again, Spielberg pioneered it or invented it or anything, but he used it to maybe its greatest effect there, because you'll see that shot a ton of times after that in a bunch of other movies. But this is the one that when people remember it, they remember that orchestral strike. So John Williams doing his work, and they remember that the zoom out, but the zoom in simultaneously. Again, the changing of it's like dilating pupils. It's changing the perspective of it. It's an immediately iconic shot. And consider, again, I constantly have to remind myself too, 1975, almost 50 years ago, may not seem like that long, but advances in technology are leaps and bounds, especially movie making technology. So consider they're shooting a lot of this movie in open waters. Yeah. They're using an animatronic shark.
Right.
They don't have access to things like drones. So aerial shots are all either extremely long jibs or helicopters. It's one of the two. That's the only two things you've got to work with. A lot of shooting on location. You can't do a lot of backlot stuff for what they did here. It's just incredibly impressive that even, I'm sure adjusted for inflation, $9 million is a lot of money compared to what it was in 75. But a single digit production pulls all of this off with name actors. I mean, people who, again, even if they weren't super well known then, will go on to be, and I'm sure commanded a decent price with a famous novel. So you got to buy the rights to that in the first place. Again, the novel was a bestseller at this point. It really is a testament, and it explains why Spielberg is able to go from this movie to do all the other stuff he does afterward.
Right.
Because like you said, it's this and the 1-2 punch of Close Encounters, which is a very similar, relatively low budget, extremely high concept, special effects laden blockbuster. not scary. Not scary in the way people wanted it to be, I think. But a little creepy, but yeah.
And this is another one of those films that you mentioned, John Williams, that just, John Williams, of course there's been music in movies before this, and music's always been important to film. But John Williams, his scores in films like this and Star Wars, and Indiana Jones, the one I said 1-2 punch earlier, but the 1-2 punch of visual stimulation plus music cues at the right spot, or orchestra performances that just match the flow of the film. It adds to it in so many ways, and it's today, and especially in a lot of horror films, because again, I'm a big horror aficionado. It's replaced with jump scares or loud noises or techno beats or trap music or what have you. And it doesn't have the same effect. I hate reminiscing on the quote unquote good old days and talking about how horror movies were perfected in the late 70s to mid to late 80s, but they really were. I don't know how it gets much better than stuff like this. And 102 critics agree with me, so I'm right. And that's what's important.
and that's really all you got to say.
Yeah.
There are some, I've been trying to kind of gather as much as I can here. There's some differences between this and the novel. Again, we talked about the
Shark Mafia
affair between, there's the mafia gets involved, which is super weird. The affair between Hooper and then Brody's wife. The ending is fairly famously different. Again, Hooper doesn't make it. He is the cage is destroyed and he gets eaten, basically. But Quint goes out pretty much the same way. The shark itself doesn't exactly die. identically to the way it did. The whole thing with the tank getting caught in the shark's mouth and getting shot. None of that is the case. That's very cinematic, and you can tell it's very Spielbergian, much like the T-Rex at the end of Jurassic Park. I do recall, and I didn't put it on the notes, but I thought this was worth noting, because Benchley and Spielberg didn't always get along. Benchley, especially when Spielberg said that's how he wanted it to end, said that's ridiculous. That would never work that way. CO2 doesn't explode the same way that you're looking at here. It's just not, it's silly. It's just not worth it. Spielberg told him it doesn't matter. By this point in the movie, by the time we get to this point, I will have them eating out of the palm of my hand. They will accept anything. And he's right. He's right. I knew this going in. I did the notes for this show before I watched the movie. I still knew going into that moment that was going to be the case. No part of me thought, well, that's silly. That would never work, because you're hook, line, and sinker at that point. No pun intended. Since it's a shark movie.
It's a fish movie. Yeah.
It's the same thing with Jurassic Park. We talked about how ridiculous so much of what happens in that final scene
the Ninja
in
T-Rex.
the visitor center is. The Ninja T-Rex, the fact that the raptor stops the attack on the humans long enough to watch what's happening in the background. It's ridiculous, but you're at that point, you're so invested in the characters, you're so invested in the story, and he has so masterfully done all the right beats. It doesn't matter. And this is Steven Spielberg, I think, nowadays gets lost in the conversation because, number one, he hasn't had a major hit in years. And number two, it just seems so, it's like saying your favorite movie is Star Wars, I guess. Like a lot of people go, I don't even think about that. Yeah. Right. I don't even think about that being the case. Or picking, you and I, this is a good comparison for us, saying Final Fantasy VII is your favorite Final Fantasy. Well, of course it is, because it's everybody played it when they were kids, if they were our age, and they loved it and it was great and blah, blah, blah. But I got to go to something that's not the case.
I hate to be Jesse. I don't want to be the contrarian, but
you just feel like it's too obvious, I guess, is what I'm going.
It's the obvious answer.
And Spielberg, I think, deserves a little more credit than that sometimes. Like you said, there are times that you straight up forget that he directed some movies because you just go, well, it's just a great movie. Of course,
Spielberg.
He's a great director.
Spielberg created some of the most memorable and well-directed films of all time. I mean, like it's like George Lucas. When you talk about Lucas, like, everybody kind of makes fun of Lucas because how weird Star Wars got, but I mean, he's a very good director, and he made a lot of money. He made a lot of good films that weren't Star Wars.
Absolutely,
just what he's remembered for. But I think Spielberg has a better catalog. Lucas had some good films.
Oh yeah,
but it was American Graffiti, THX, whatever. But
THX 113.
Yeah,
American Graffiti is really the other one that I would, if I were him, I would hang my hat on.
Sure.
I have seen that, weirdly. My dad has it,
same.
and there was a
long time ago
hop where we sat and watched it, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. But Spielberg, I mean, you can jump from Jaws to Close Encounters to E.T. to Raiders and every other Indiana Jones from that point forward to this. I already said this movie. What was the other one? I was just jumping over something. Jurassic Park that we were just talking about. To Schindler's List. I mean, it's just an incredible catalog, and so varied. He does so many different kinds of things. It's just a shame that in the past, maybe 15 years, there really hasn't been anything of major note. He did Ready Player One, which very much felt like a Spielberg movie, just didn't work very well.
Sure. I'm looking through his
Indiana Jones movies. He didn't even do the last one, so.
I'm looking through his history here. He did Lincoln, which was really good. War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise, which I thought was actually a very good film. Catch Me If You Can, Minority Report. So, he had a lot of great films. But
all those were great. Oh, my God, I forgot that a bunch of those for him, too.
Yeah, but that was also
good.
Early 2000s, which was 20 years ago. So, but the man's earned his place there. All right, let's get to the review, and then I'll talk about the ending too, because it's not that I dislike it, but we'll talk about it in a second. Reviews. With the show here, of course, we do the 5-point review. It's 2 thumbs up means you love it. 1 thumbs up means you liked it. 1 up, 1 down is you are neutral. 1 down is you didn't like it. 2 down is you hated it. With the review, I'll go first as per usual, and I went into this movie before I actually watched it thinking it was going to be a 1 thumb up, but after watching it, I'm going to go with 2 thumbs up. I think this is an absolute classic of a film. It's one of the greatest films of all time. It's one of the greatest horror films of all time. Whenever you talk about most influential films in history, this has to be in the discussion. It's got great performances. It's got great tension. It's got blood and guts if you like that. It's got a naked girl if you got the 4K version. You can see more if you're into that. It has everything that a good horror film should have. Likable characters. It has memorable moments, great acting, great cinematography. I can go down the laundry list of how good this film is. It's a shame that they made so many sequels that lost the point. And not just in like part
really
2.
Is.
Once you get past part 2, I mean, you're talking about almost shark exploitation films at that point. One of the films includes the shark who is seeking revenge against the Brody family for the death of the shark in this movie. He tracks them down like a serial killer in another place.
Yeah.
It's horrible. And it's sad that they based that on such a great classic film. And I know this is probably the shortest review I've ever given, but I really cannot think of many things I didn't like about this movie. Maybe there are parts that linger, but man, I'd be hard pressed to tell you which one it is. It's got great everything. They don't make them like this anymore is what I'm trying to say, and it's 2 thumbs up from me. Hunter.
Yeah, me too. And you said exactly what I was going to say at the beginning. I went into this thinking this is probably going to be, well, I guess to be fair, I went into this movie having not seen it. I mentioned that earlier. As a kid, I didn't like horror movies. I couldn't sleep if I watched something scary, so I just wouldn't do it. So it wasn't until years later that I started catching up on things. And somehow this just slipped through the cracks. Like Rocky, which we watched earlier this year for this show, it's something that I felt like I knew a lot about, but I just didn't have all the puzzle pieces together. So sat down, watched it beginning to end, and I remember thinking fairly early into it, this is going to be 1 thumb up for me. This is going to be a 1 thumb movie. It's really good, but I think there are some flaws. I think sometimes it's a little hokey. There are things about it that just aren't quite hitting. But I really, again, for me, and Sarah called it, she was right. Once the orca leaves the shore and it's just those 3 guys, nothing to say, bad about the beginning of the movie, but I thought it was a little more up and down. Once the boat leaves, it becomes a whole different movie in a good way, not in a, there are lesser movies I might criticize for that. Hey, you really only need the back half of this, but the back half of it is so informed by what happens up to that point that it is just tension highs. And even when it seems like things shouldn't be tense. That scene of Quint obviously explaining what happened to him on the Indianapolis, now on a super iconic scene, just the 3 of them trying to relax a little bit, and then the shark literally starts hammerheading the side of the boat. It's just incredible. I mean, it's riveting from that moment forward, which is like the last 45 minutes or so of a 2-hour movie. That's almost half of the time. I also don't have a bad thing to say about it. Not in a sense that it would lower a rating. Like you said, there are a few little things that I thought, that's kind of, I wish that wasn't the way that it was or whatever. But, I think it's also informed by the time and culture. 1975 was a very different time than we live in now. And that's another thing that I really wish I'd had time to kind of talk to my dad about and ask him, hey, when this came out, right, and it's so informed by what's happening at that time. Like, for all these things that felt a little hokey, is that not kind of the way that things were? And I have a feeling that was the case. It's a movie of its time, and yet it still holds up all these years later, almost 50 years later. That's impressive. Is it something I'm angling to sit down and watch again, over and over? Not necessarily. not in a way that I think's bad. Yeah, angling. But it's a... Well, oh yeah, I didn't even get that, and then I did. Hey, well, look what I did there.
Oh, did you catch that? Sorry.
It's sorry. I'm sorry. It's a horror movie, and I've said several times over, as much as I like horror, I'm not a big fan of let's watch the same horror movie multiple times.
Sure.
I feel like this is going to fall into the same category as Pulp Fiction for me. It's a movie that I have seen, and it was very good, but I'm not necessarily, like I said, going to make a big point to sit down and watch it again. But it's 2 thumbs up. I can't find enough of a flaw in here to say that it's not the case.
Yeah.
I think if you and I have joked a couple times now, if you're afraid of sharks, just don't go in the water. It's that easy. And so you're going to spend this movie going, just stop doing it. But then every time that it happens, you can see why that's the case, why people keep doing it.
Right. So because people are stupid. There's a part where everyone chases the shark. Yeah. Everyone goes after him.
Yes.
And they're like, you guys are all going to die doing this. But people would absolutely do that. It's famous in a lot of horror films. When the town, it's Frankenstein, when the townspeople gather up their pitchforks and torches and go after the monster. Well, of course the monster's going to get you. But yeah, it's brilliant.
I love too that there's so many different reasons for people to keep doing that. It's not just one idiot after another doing the same thing. Is it the promise of money? Is it revenge for what happened to someone else?
To protect the ones they love.
The idea that fame, right? Yeah, to protect the people that they love. The fame of being the one to actually accomplish the thing, or is it just hubris? Is it just I think I'm better? It's just a dumb shark.
Which
like how bad can it be? Yeah, well, to a certain degree, it definitely was. But yeah, there's so many different. It's like revert. Well, they're motivations, so it's not reverse motivation, but it's not. They're not positive character qualities. They're not traits. Right. They're negative ones.
Yeah.
And that's really impressive. And again, if anybody was going to pull it off, it's Steven Spielberg, who is the king of being able to manage multiple characters with different kinds of personalities and yet get them all to work together in the same situation. It's a masterclass. It's a masterclass in filmmaking, especially in difficult filmmaking on location with animatronic stuff that's never been tried before. If anybody was going to do it, it was him in the water. That's maybe the most impressive part. Yeah, it's just extremely impressive, and I'm glad I finally sat down and got to watch it.
I appreciate the fact also that when you ever notice when it's you and I doing films, just the two of us, we hardly ever curse. I don't think we said a single curse word during this whole show.
I did once earlier, and I don't remember what it was about, but it was very light. It was very quick. Yes. We were in, we were out. It might have been about all those ridiculous.
They're terrible
shark movies.
I said shark dick. So
Well, I think you would have to do that. So
the ending of this film, Hooper suits up, enters a shark-proof cage, intending to lethally inject the shark with strychnine via a hypodermic spear. The shark viciously attacks the cage. Hunter wrote this up, thank God, causing Hooper to drop the spear. While the shark destroys the cage, Hooper escapes to the seabed. Shark leaps onto the boat's stern, subsequently devouring Quint, which, again, a little hokey, but he sells it so well. I think if anything could benefit from a update, it'd be that scene.
Yes, and again, I would have been. I know they didn't want to, or I'm sure Spielberg himself didn't want to take away from us seeing that happening in the moment, but it was just the material they had to use to make the shark made it a little. Yeah, I would have been perfectly fine with seeing part of it happen, seeing him enter the water, and then just seeing the blood. That would have been fine.
Yeah. Trapped on the sinking vessel, Brody shoves a scuba tank at the shark's mouth and, climbing onto the crow's nest, shoots the tank with a rifle. The resulting explosion kills the shark. Hooper resurfaces, and he and Brody paddle back to Amity Island, clinging to the remaining barrels. And that's the part I didn't like about the ending was I didn't even think about the CO2 thing, because you're right, they got me. I never stopped to think about it. I was like, that makes sense. You shoot it, blows up, kills the shark. It's the way it all happens.
Yeah, kind of.
It's him throwing it in the shark's mouth, taking aim, and of course getting the one-liner in as he shoots. It was a little too Hollywood, but it is a Hollywood film. That's why I can't criticize it too much. It felt very action movie-like. It almost felt like I could see Stallone in that role, or Schwarzenegger making a little quip before he kills him. But that's every film pretty much where they kill the monster is they say something. But for a film like this, because it is so well done and so well acted and so smart and so mature, I think they could have done without the quip. But this was in 78. I'm sorry, 75. So this is before every film was doing it. So they're kind of an originator. So who am I to argue with that? Besides that one little nitpick, it's a great ending. Seeing them paddle back to, they're like, just keep paddling. It's the funny little cherry on top of a fantastic film. So where do you go from here in the epilogues? Well, they did make 3 sequels to the film, which
oh boy did they!
I would like to read off the IMDb of the little blurbs about them really quick, so you know what we're talking about. So Jaws 2.
Now, Roy Scheider did come back for Jaws 2. Spielberg did not. He specifically said it was something about it's just a carny move to make like multiple ones over and over. And it is, but Roy Scheider, I think Lorraine Gray came back,
and Murray Hamilton as Mayor Vaughn. All 3 of them came back. No Richard Dreyfuss, unfortunately. But like I said, this was the only one that was probably a decent film. It's got a 5.8 out of 10 on IMDb. Police Chief Brody must protect the citizens of Amity after a second monstrous shark begins terrorizing the waters. It's just a rehash. That's the problem. It's a rehash with the charm, without the charm and wit of the first one. Now, this is where it gets bad. This is where it gets bad. The second film, though it has a good cast, including the third film, Jaws 3D, because as you know, 1983, 3D was all the rage.
Everything had to be.
Right.
Of course.
This is a film that stars Dennis Quaid, who up until about a week ago I really liked, Louis Gossett Jr., who I will always like, and Leah Thompson, who I'll always like. This one got a 3.7 out of 10. A giant 35-foot shark becomes trapped in a SeaWorld theme park, and it's up to the sons of Police Chief Brody to rescue everyone. Yeah, they pulled that move. Like, well, it's the Die Hard thing. Something really similar happened, and the only person that can stop it happens to be someone related to the very first time this happened. Thank God he's here. And then, of course, there's the all-time great Jaws: The Revenge from 1987, called one of, if not the worst sequels in movie history. Listen to this cast. Lorraine Gray came back for it. Mario Van Peebles is in it. I love Mario Van Peebles. Michael Caine is in this film.
Sure. Why not?
Chief Brody's widow, because he died from, if I remember correctly, a heart attack caused by the fear of the shark, believes that her family, believes that her family is deliberately being targeted by another shark in search of revenge. It's so bad and laughable, but at the same time, the balls on them to take that route. Hunter, I don't have anything for this. I like to tackle what happens to these characters after the fact. If this were a real place and a real town, this would be something that would haunt him probably forever. Watching all this go down, he would be hailed as a hero when he came back. He would probably watch that water for the rest of his life for another shark fin. I think the town would celebrate. It would go on like all small towns do after a tragedy, and they would probably have every 10 years they would have some kind of festival honoring this event, and they would have like a giant left shark puppet out there or something. That's the best I got. The sequels ruined any idea I had for how to continue this on. What do you got left?
Yeah, I sometimes pitch a sequel. Like that's a common refrain for me when we get to this point. Rather than
a sequel.
I was going to say rather than epilogue, but yeah, no, this is the epitome of a movie. And I said that about Jurassic Park too, but then to be fair, I went on and pitched a couple of ideas. I'm not going to do that here. There should not be a sequel to this movie. It makes zero sense for these events to take place again.
Right.
This is and I get why they had to make sequels. I get money. That it's a blockbuster movie. It makes $1 billion, and you got to do it all over again. But from a story perspective, from just a storytelling perspective, there's no need to tell the story again. Not in the same way. Now, to be fair, if you wanted to do some version of this where Hooper goes on to offer his expertise in similar situations, he's the guy you follow for a sequel. Kind of the same way you follow Malcolm in Lost World. He becomes the expert. He gets
called to another place.
Right, you go to another location and handle another situation, but it's never going to be this intense, right? Hooper basically becomes Quint at this moment. He's got this story to tell. His Indianapolis will always be the shark at Amity Island. It makes zero sense to me to follow Brody again. Brody, like you said, goes on to be traumatized, but does what he can living out his life in this location. Hopefully these people have learned their lessons, and it's Hooper who you would have to follow. He's the one who I'm most interested in the epilogue for. And again, I think he becomes a form of Quint, maybe not quite as salty, maybe not quite as not quite as a classic old sea dog as Quint was, but he has that story. And so now he has the wherewithal and the understanding of what happens in these events to be the Quint for some other group. That to me, that's your sequel. There's no reason, or not sequel, but that's your epilogue. That's your interesting epilogue, is following up on that character. And it's Richard Dreyfuss. So, I mean, you've got an important guy to follow around there too. If you could lock him in for further viewings like this, then that would have been great. You could also kill him in the sequel, because he probably should have died in this one like he did in the novel. That's one change I didn't fully understand. I would have been okay with him dying in the movie, as much as I like the character.
Just without the affair. Yeah, because the fact that he got away was a little nonsensical. That the shark
was a little crazy in the first place.
Attacks the cage and lets him go. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Now that you said it, I'm kind of pissed off that they decided to, instead of following the most logical character, Hooper, into another shark adventure somewhere else. Like, hey, here's this story out of Amity. This guy helped wrangle in this murderous shark. Yeah. Now you call
he's an oceanographer.
He's the Alan Grant of
right.
You call in the expert, and maybe you have something in SeaWorld, or you have something on the West Coast or something. That's going on. But instead, they chose to follow the sons of the character from the first film as the sharks look for revenge.
It's just silly.
Let that sink in.
It's just so goofy.
Let that sink in for a little bit. It stinks. It stinks.
And Roy Scheider's a great actor. I mean, I love to see him again, on the screen like that. But I just that specific story is such a goofy way of doing it. When again, you had a character there who travels, who does these things for a living, who could have held a movie on his own. It's Richard Dreyfuss, man.
Yeah,
he's a great actor.
It's too much.
Up with other people and,
it's too much like Die Hard for me, where I always say, why does everything always happen to John McClane? How is he always in this position every single time? It makes no sense.
I was perfectly fine with accepting a second Die Hard, right? Because the second time, and actually the second one should have been the third one, which is where he gets targeted by Hans's kid, right? He gets targeted by his son. That makes sense. Somebody else wants revenge on this guy who killed his father and ruined all his plans. Every other version is just also, he is no longer just a street smart cop who gets caught in a bad situation. Now he's a superhero. I mean, when he's full on running from helicopters and just gets goofy. It's not the show, but
it's the plight of blockbusters. But it's the plight of blockbusters when you strike gold. When you strike gold. Yeah. But for some characters, it works. Indiana Jones is going to find new adventures to get into. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Well, Indiana Jones is built on a framework for that. The classic dime store pulp novels. That's what Indiana Jones was from the get-go. That's a character that's built to have different kinds of ridiculous, over-the-top adventures. And you tell one per movie, and you don't even reference the other ones. Maybe there's a few little shout-outs here and there, but
James Bond.
They're meant to be separate things. James Bond is very much the more suave. Well, James Bond is suave, but the more Indiana Jones is, but the more refined, I guess, version of those stories.
But Sheriff Brody?
No. Sheriff Brody is perfect. This is why horror movies don't work by bringing the exact same character back every time over and over and over again. There's a few times you can get away with that.
Scream. Scream did it too much. It did it too.
Scream did it too much.
Sydney did it. Yeah, too much Sydney. I was glad when they changed, and now they're bringing it back.
I love those movies. I love those movies, but there was a point where every one of those characters should have been gone if they're going to continuously be targeted the way they were. Laurie Strode gets to be a totally ridiculous Terminator-esque, Sarah Connor type character by the end of it. And
Sarah Connor makes sense because of the story. Yeah. Guys. But when you make $1 million, you make you make $500 billion because $1 million ain't shit these days. There's the curse word. Now I'm getting angry. You have to churn out these sequels, and you got to get the likable characters back, and you put them in more ridiculous situations, and it always ends up, it hardly ever ends up being as good as the original, and eventually it becomes a parody of itself. And I wish more things didn't do that. This is not the show for it. We got to do an extras epilogues one day. All right, that's it. That's it. The balcony is closed. We're calling it. We'll be back tomorrow night with an all new After Dark. We'll have some fun stuff. Sorry about last night. Scheduling didn't work out. We're going to try to get that new episode of Fallout on PZ85 plays up as soon as we can and record it as soon as we can. But until then, for myself and for Double H, thanks for tuning in. And I know what I would say at the end of this episode, but I'm curious what you would say at the end of this episode, Hunter.
You're going to need a longer podcast.
Disagree.